I don't know if John's got grade 8 or not.
No.
No, there we are.
Well, I didn't want to pull rank there.
I started writing. I didn't start writing for national newspapers until 1998, when I think it was through Mark Pappenheim, I got asked at the very last minute to review the George Russell Orchestra at the Barbican. And so, I don't think I'd ever really done a live review, but I went along with my notebook and wrote a review and filed it the next day, and they seemed to like it. It got published. It's very, very satisfying seeing your notice published in the paper for the first time. And then after that, I got asked to do regular live reviews of quite an interesting mixture of things. Never pop music, never straight repertoire classical music, but the stuff that I tend to call creative music, which includes improvisation and electronica and jazz and a bit of left field pop and so on. And then I also got to write a regular column for a while, which meant I could sort of mix together concerts I'd been to that no one was interested in reviewing, but I could mention a concert in passing and then mention someone's CD and so on. So I found that a very comfortable way of writing about music. And then 2 years later, I had one of those phone calls about, can we meet in a coffee somewhere off the Farringdon Road? It was all very secretive because they thought I was actually on contract with the Independent, but the Guardian then took me on contract for a while, and I carried on doing a similar sort of thing for the Guardian. But I realised in retrospect, I started writing for newspapers at a really fantastic time, because reviews from 70s and 80s, when I first started making music as a musician, have no life other than fading bits of newsprint and the scrapbook my dad compiled of everything that was written about me. And whereas everything I've written since the late 90s is still there, it's online, it's on newspaper websites. And I've realised over time, this is, as long as you're happy about what you've written, this is a fantastic thing to a fantastic thing to have, and it's unprecedented. And I think we're in a very interesting period of transition between the old dead tree means of making magazines and newspapers and reading and filing things away physically in big libraries, big departments in universities and so on, and having the virtual online equivalent of that on servers that can be accessed from anywhere in the world. Why I think it's particularly interesting for contemporary music, for what I call creative music, is that you can write about something which happens in a tiny room in London, say, with an audience that's even smaller than this one, that you think has some musical significance. And if you write about it in a way that gives just some little idea of why it's worth listening to again and why that particular composer or performer has some value, that can be read all over the world now. And although there might just be a fraction of people, as I say, it might be an audience of 12 people in a place in London, but that minority spread over the people who can have access to that article on, through the internet can be quite a big minority. And if those performers and composers go on to do more interesting things, they expand they do recordings, they get involved in multimedia work or films or whatever, make some kind of a career, then what you wrote about them can have greater significance and it can still be accessed. And I find that very exciting and satisfying. It sort of feels that what I wrote didn't just become the wrapping around fish and chips on the subsequent day. If people do wrap their fish and chips in the music supplement to the Guardian. It's a difficult time, as both Andy and Michael have indicated, but I think it's also quite an exciting time. I think the online versions of newspapers are becoming a fantastic resource. I think the tricky bit is really, and this is no news to anyone here, is how do we make money from all this new technology that we're going, all that awful word which some music sales once said to me, how do we monetize this, John? Which is, it is a big conundrum. It's a big conundrum for The Guardian, it's a conundrum for everyone who's trying to produce something. There's people who are dedicating their lives to doing very interesting music blogs that aren't yielding anything like their travel card, let alone pay for the office or pay anyone to write for them. The newspapers at the moment still have some kind of economic basis. People are still paying to advertise in print media, thankfully. So there is some kind of economic thing going along. And we're also seeing the rise of the free magazines like Stylist and Shortlist and Time Out. And you have things like Jazz UK and that Jazz in London listings magazine, which has been free forever, which these things all take their part in the sort of hybrid nature of music journalism and music publishing. So I feel it's some of the problems we're talking about are actually more to do with the nature of criticism and who do you select to criticise. How do you choose who criticises and writes about something? How do you establish some kind of vocabulary or some sort of idea of reading through a critic to find out what they really meant? I mean, I can read, for example, a piece by Adrian Searle of The Guardian about the nominees for the new Turner Prize, and I feel, I don't have to agree with Adrian Searle. I get a pretty good idea of those four artists, even though I don't share any of Adrian Searle's aesthetic views about the value or the contents of that work. I feel the same way about Alexis Petridis, who writes about pop music in The Guardian. He's an immensely entertaining and funny writer. I don't share many of his tastes at all, but he's a very interesting person to read. And if you read certain people regularly, you get a good idea of what they're writing about. So you kind of calibrate what you read to a particular critic. I think this is where it gets more difficult with the multiplicity of voices you get through blogging, that you read a random review that's very complimentary of something, and you don't know, is this actually just the brother of the percussionist in the ensemble, or is it actually somebody with a really new original view? It might be very well written, probably is, because the percussionist brother probably is also a musician, but you don't want to read just something that's a shout out for to help someone get a gig.
There are, of course, some websites where you have regularity in terms of the voice. I think of two, Classical Source and the Arts Desk. They have their regular writers, and they're just as regular as newspaper writers. The only difference is that they're not being paid and we are.
And that's becoming a new form of, it's becoming an interesting alternative
but
to
it is
the
a parallel world, and there's not much difference in terms of the actual quality of the reviewing. That is interesting.
Well, if you read Peter Coleshaw on the Arts Desk,
I know.
And Peter's very experienced, entertaining writer with strong views about all kinds of things, classical music and world music and so on. So if I read a review by Peter Coleshaw on the Arts Desk, I kind of know how to interpret it. Just to talk about the kind of pressures you get within a newspaper context, I wrote about a thing at the Royal Opera House called the Africa Weekend, which was curated by Yinka Shonibake, I hope I've pronounced his name correctly, who's a very interesting visual artist. You may remember his Nelson's Ship in the Bottle and the fourth column in Trafalgar Square. And he curated a whole weekend of, organised, helped choose a whole weekend of various musical things happening at the Royal Opera House, and also film being shown outside. The opening night, he said, he gave a very, very interesting talk before it all kicked off, and said, I thought the Opera House needed to have a club night, so he got Tony Allen's band to start the festival in the Limbury space, deep in the basement there. The following day I went along to see a performance by Victor Garma, who's a very interesting Angolan musician and instrument maker. And he was giving a series of solo pieces and duos and trios using instruments that he's made, which derive in part from African instruments, but they're completely, they're modern technology, but they're acoustic instruments, and he also used a little bit of electronics with them, and it's very, very interesting contemporary music event. Involves some written pieces, some improvisation, and I thought that's absolutely fantastic, and the lion's share of my review was about that event. But of course it went into the paper as the lead review on Monday, and the lead picture is Tony Allen's band with Damon Albarn right at the front, at the microphone, because in terms of the paper's view of how to present that concert, Damon Albarn is the figure that people recognise. He wasn't even a very important part of Tony Allen's concert, but that was the picture that the picture editor chose for that day. Online, it's a smaller picture. Online, to me, it would have been quite nice to include some examples of Victor Garber's illustrations because they're visually very striking, and in a sense, to see those pictures would help you understand what I was writing about. But that's not something I have any choice in the matter. But I think that's going back to my point about we're in this, quite a positive era for the integration of print and online. I think the ability to put more pictures and embed video clips and links to other things is actually part of what makes writing for online very exciting.
And closer to the actual thing in musical terms.
Exactly. It can, you can read. I mean, the critic writing is framing can be framing a whole series of experiences, which could lead the reader to a completely different conclusion.
At different levels. Yeah.
But that's absolutely fine.
You said earlier that your job was to look for significance and value. Is that the job of the critics? Look for significance?
Well, I think you hope for that.
What is significance?
Well, I think if you go along to... I mean, I generally write about things that... I try to write about things I haven't written about very much before, so it's something that's new, or to find a fresh angle on something that's been around before. And I suppose value is the most important thing to go about. I do have some personal idea of what I think is good and bad music, but ultimately, that doesn't accord with a lot of other people, and I have to accept that for many years, in fact. But I try and write about why I think it's of value, and there are to go back to significance. That's often to do. It sounds rather a pretentious word, doesn't it? But you can have something which is musically valuable up to a point. It's not the most fantastic version of this kind of music you ever heard, but something because of the place and the time and the particular musicians and particular scene they come from, it has a great deal of significance. It connects with people, and that's something you might only understand by going along to a concert, whereas you might not by hearing it cold on the radio or on a CD.
It connects in some special way.
Yes, indeed. So you actually, it's the wonderful thing about performance. You're seeing not just pure music, or you're not hearing just pure music. You're hearing the interplay of people making music and the audience, and the way the audience actually might bring something else out of that performance. And I think it's the job of the writer to try and capture a little bit of that. But one hopes to give some sort of flavour of what's significant and what's valuable and what's enjoyable. Like Michael, I do go along expecting to have a good time. I don't go along thinking, this is going to be terrible, I'll enjoy writing a bad review, which is what John Peel once said. John Peel once wrote that he enjoyed writing about the bad reviews the terrible bands much more than the good bands.
Easy to write.
I can't sympathise.
Bad reviews are very easy to write. Reviews that praise are actually much harder.
You have to commit with the praise.
Well, it's you can have fun, you can be rude if you're destroying it. But if you are extolling it, then it's difficult to be actually rather interesting at length.
That's interesting.
Anyone the danger you can be too bland, actually.
Yeah, and not match the magnificence of it.
Yeah.
Anyone want to come back? Anything, what John has said?
I suppose it is a question almost for everyone so far. Do you think it's important to be upfront and honest about where you're coming from, what your motivations for writing about the music are, before you give your viewpoint, so that people can understand that it is coming from a particular person at a particular time, particular place?
I don't want to keep on quoting Hume, but it occurs to me that he also said that a critic is like a friend. You pick your critics as you would your friends because you feel you've got something in common, and you may begin to understand why that is, because they've got certain likes and dislikes. I think if I'm objecting to a certain soprano singer, I probably should mention that I don't particularly like operatic singing in general or something of that kind, and so it's clear that it's, in that case, you're not so interested in, there's not really a discrimination going on here, it's just an expression of a personal preference.
So doesn't that make it kind of impossible to establish a universal significance of anything? It's more about what it means to you.
Well, I think that's the role of the critic, is to be is to try and separate those things and to try and understand when they're being swayed by something that's peculiar to them. You know, the way that a certain song has been destroyed for them by its presence in a commercial when they were a kid or something, you know, that they kept on seeing. It's very hard to be positive critically about something you dislike. You know, you might say, you know, Mike might.
Well, I mean, I can't stand Elgar. I tend to say that. If I have to review him, I start by saying he's not my cup of tea, but this, you know, worked or didn't work. But as for laying out my credentials, I mean, there's no space. 400 words, you can't do it. As you said, you've just got to get to know the critic, and over time you realise what their prejudices are, their strengths, their weaknesses, and I think that's the best you can have.
It's a kind of conversation, you know, that it's not saying you like this is the best, you like this, that's not so good, don't like that. And there's a place for liking anything, and there's a place for appreciating anything. And it's about debate, but debate is about giving reasons, not saying I like spinach, I don't like spinach.
But the general question about subjective or objective, I mean, clearly it must be subjective. It has to be. Otherwise it's not a response. If it's not a response, then forget it.
Presumably there's already a view that's been expressed by the arts editor as to A, whether it's reviewed, and B, who they send along to it, whether it's somebody who might be sympathetic to it or somebody who can't stand it.
Yes. Well, if he can't stand opera, he should never read opera.
No, that's not.
And you should never hear Elgar.
Yeah, quite. I try to avoid it.
Just putting my editor's hat on, I'd like to make a plea for a certain amount of objectivity, because I commission reviews of things in the graphic design world, and it's quite often what you get, particularly with a young reviewer, is all opinion and all self, and very little about what they actually went to. So you get this sort of 400 words of personal response, and then you ask the question, well, where did it take place? How many people were involved in it? Roughly what it looked like, what colour was it? There's all those kind of, there usually are objective things. It was a 20-piece ensemble, it was a solo performance. It's quite useful if you're a reader and you may know more about that particular artist than the person writing the review. So if they put in some objective information, you're able to kind of read through it in a better way.
Pick up something from the question, because I don't think it was just about whether it's a subjective or an objective opinion. It's about whether the writing is in some way reflexive, or at least critically reflexive, placing the writer within it. Yeah. I know that within a 300-word frame it's very difficult to do that, but one of the things that can be done, and I absolutely cheer for what John said, about describing something of the atmosphere of what it was like to be there on that particular occasion. My particular baggage is that music happens in the one particular moment when it happens. And unless to give a judgment as if that music is objectified, and that's how it always is, and that's, it's good or bad music, it's actually a good or a bad experience depending on whether it's a good or a bad performance, and a whole set of circumstances that come to it. There is good and bad music, I would suggest as well, but the writing should at least perhaps give a sense that the body of a reviewer was in the space where the reviewing was done, not kind of in the pub next door. Right.
Thanks. Why don't we move on to you? Ed McCohen, he programmes, commissions and produces live events around new music.